The office still smelled like burnt espresso and overheated plastic when Lena dragged the CEO's email into a folder called Documentation. No tears, no slammed keyboard. Just one slow breath while rain crawled down the glass walls of the 23rd floor like silver threads. Then she opened her contract, highlighted 3 lines, and quietly stopped doing the jobs of 6 people. Somewhere deep in legal, at 6:14 a.m., counsel opened a report marked Section 11 Operations Dependency Review, and suddenly the entire company looked different. At 8:03 Monday morning, the office lights flickered awake, one row at a time, like dominoes of artificial daylight. Lena was already there, not because she had to be, because for the last 4 years, she always was. The kind of employee people stopped noticing precisely because she solved problems before they became visible. The kind who remembered vendor passwords no one documented. The kind who answered quick questions that consumed entire evenings. The kind executives called reliable when they meant convenient. Outside the glass facade, downtown Chicago dissolved into cold spring rain. Inside, monitors hummed softly, coffee machines hissed, Slack notifications popped like distant popcorn fire. And sitting in the middle of it all, under the pale blue light of dual monitors, Lana reread the email. Short, clinical, cruel in the polished corporate way. You're still not ready for a promotion. Maybe in 2 years. No explanation, no metrics, no acknowledgement of the fact that she had practically held operations together during the merger disaster 6 months earlier. Just that sentence, and beneath it, the CEO's neat digital signature, Ethan Vale. She stared at it for a long moment, then calmly clicked. Save as arrow documentation. No dramatic reaction. That was what unsettled people later, the absence of visible anger. Because anger was easy to dismiss. Calm was dangerous. A chair rolled behind her. "Morning," said Noah from finance, balancing 2 coffees. "You survived the Sunday board prep?" "Mm-hmm." "You look terrifyingly calm." "I got an answer." "Oh?" She turned her monitor 2 inches toward him. He read the email, then blinked once. "Wow." Another blink. "Wow." Lena took her coffee. "Thanks." "That's it? That's your reaction?" "What reaction would improve the situation?" Noah opened his mouth, closed it again. Somewhere nearby, someone laughed too loudly in marketing. A printer started choking on paper. The office carried on with its usual artificial heartbeat. But Noah kept looking at her carefully. "You know," he said quietly, "half the executive floor thinks you already run operations. That's the problem." "What do you mean?" "They think I'll keep doing it for free." That landed heavier than he expected. He leaned back slowly. Because suddenly the invisible architecture of the company became obvious. Lena wasn't just an operations manager. She was the bridge between departments that refused to talk to each other. She rewrote vendor contracts when legal stalled. She fixed scheduling disasters HR created. She caught accounting discrepancies before audits found them. She trained managers, updated undocumented workflows, handled escalation calls. Executives were too important to answer. And none of it officially existed in her role description, which meant none of it was protected, or compensated or replaceable. At least that's what leadership assumed. A notification flashed across her screen. 9 a.m. Executive Operations Sync. Lena opened another tab instead. Her employment contract. Page 14, Section 11. She read every line slowly, then highlighted 3 paragraphs in pale yellow. Noah watched her. "What are you doing?" "Adjusting expectations." He gave a nervous laugh. "You sound like legal." "No," she said softly. "Legal sends warnings. I'm just following policy." That sentence would echo through the building later like a dropped knife. But at 8:27 a.m., nobody noticed. Not yet. The executive meeting began exactly on time. 22 people joined. 3 were late anyway. Cameras flickered on across conference rooms and airport lounges and expensive home offices with carefully curated bookshelves. Ethan Vale appeared last. Sharp suit, silver tie, perfect lighting. The kind of face that looked trustworthy in magazines. "Morning, everyone," he said smoothly. "Let's keep this efficient." Lena muted herself and listened. Forecasts, acquisition updates, supply chain risks, revenue projections, the usual theater. Then came the first crack. "Where are we on the Zurich compliance migration?" Ethan asked casually. Silence. A few eyes shifted. Finally, Priya from compliance spoke carefully. "We're awaiting the finalized operations mapping." Ethan frowned. "I thought that was completed." Another silence. Then all at once, subtly, almost unconsciously, people looked at Lena's square on the screen. Ethan noticed. "Lena." She looked up calmly. "Yes? Can you update us?" "I can update on the responsibilities defined within my operational scope." The sentence sounded polite, technically flawless, completely abnormal. Ethan blinked once. "All right." She clicked open a document. The Zurich migration workflow requires cross-departmental legal reconciliation, vendor sequencing approval, and regional staffing validation. Those functions are currently assigned to executive integration and compliance strategy. Tiny pause. Not operations management. Silence spread slowly through the call, like ink through water. Someone in finance muted themselves too late. A cough hid a laugh. Ethan's expression sharpened slightly. "Well," he said, "you've been coordinating that process." "Informally," Lena replied. Another pause. "I reviewed my contract this morning." Noah, watching remotely from finance, nearly choked on coffee. Because everyone on that call understood what she was really saying. For years, Lena had absorbed structural gaps nobody wanted to formally own. And now, she had stopped. Not emotionally, procedurally, which was infinitely worse. Ethan straightened. "Let's discuss this offline." "Of course." She smiled politely, then muted herself again. The meeting continued, but something fundamental had shifted. You could almost hear it, like the first groan inside a frozen lake before the ice cracks. By noon, small operational anomalies started appearing. Nothing catastrophic. That was the brilliance of it. Lena understood systems too well to create visible sabotage. Instead, she simply removed invisible support. A vendor onboarding request sat unanswered because it technically belonged to procurement. A scheduling conflict remained unresolved because HR owned calendar coordination. A compliance clarification waited in legal's queue because Lana stopped rewriting legal summaries for them after hours. Tiny things. Normal things. Things every department was supposedly designed to handle. Except they weren't. Because over time, the company had quietly evolved around one dangerous assumption. Lena would catch it. Always. At 1:17 p.m., Ethan's assistant called. "Hey, Lena. Ethan needs the revised integration packet before 3. Lena checked the request. Normally, she would have stayed late to finish it herself. Today she opened the ownership matrix. Integration packet revisions are assigned to strategy operations. Pause. Well, yes, technically. Then they should have access to the template. Another pause. They don't know how to finalize the risk sections. Lena took a sip of coffee. I'm sure leadership can resolve that. The line went silent. Not angry. Stunned. Because for the first time, the machine had encountered friction where there used to be lubrication. And friction creates heat very quickly. At 4:42 p.m., Council received an internal document request. Routine on the surface, generated automatically through compliance systems. But one phrase triggered review escalation protocols. Section 11, Operations Dependency Assessment. The junior legal analyst reading it frowned, opened the attached matrix, then sat up straighter. Because the document showed something ugly. Critical operational functions across 6 departments had no formal ownership except informal dependency on one mid-level manager, Lena Morales. No redundancy, no delegation structure, no executive acknowledgement, no compensation alignment. And worst of all, the dependency trail was documented. Timestamps, approvals, escalation histories, years of them. The analyst forwarded it upward. By 6:14 a.m. the next morning, Senior Counsel Daniel Reeves opened the report himself. 3 minutes later, he canceled breakfast. 7 minutes later, he emailed the CEO's office directly. Subject line, critical gap. And for the first time in years, silence spread across the executive floor. Not loud panic, not shouting, the more dangerous kind, the quiet kind, the kind where people suddenly start rereading old emails, especially the ones they assumed nobody saved. The next morning, Lena arrived exactly at 9 o'clock. Not early, not late, exactly according to contract. And somehow that frightened people more than if she had screamed. Because the company was beginning to realize something terrifying. The system had never actually been stable. It had only been held together by one exhausted woman pretending not to notice. And now she had noticed. At 9:12 a.m., Ethan Vale requested an emergency meeting with counsel. At 9:13, Lena's calendar received an invitation marked mandatory attendance. She looked at it for 3 silent seconds, then smiled very slightly. The game had finally become visible. And executives hate visibility, especially when legal starts asking questions nobody can comfortably answer. Something much bigger was moving now, and Lena knew it before anyone else did. The elevator to the executive floor moved too smoothly. That was Lena's first thought. Silent, expensive, carefully engineered to create the illusion that powerful people floated above ordinary gravity. She stood alone inside it at 9:26 a.m., one hand around a paper coffee cup already turning cold. Stainless steel walls reflected fragments of her expression back at her. Calm eyes, dark circles, posture too straight for someone who had slept barely 4 hours. Floor numbers climbed slowly. By the time the doors opened on 23, the atmosphere had already changed. People were quieter up here. Not peaceful quiet, defensive quiet. Assistants lowered voices mid-sentence. Screens switched tabs too quickly. Someone from legal walked past, carrying printed binders with fluorescent markers sticking out like warning flags. Lena stepped onto charcoal gray carpet that absorbed sound like fresh snow. Ethan's assistant looked up immediately. "Lena, they're waiting." Of course they were. The glass conference room at the end of the corridor looked almost surgical in the morning light. Pale sky, chrome edges, a long black table polished enough to reflect hands like water. Inside sat 5 people: CEO, COO, head of HR senior counsel, Daniel Reeves, and a woman Lena had never seen before. External counsel. Interesting. Very interesting. Ethan stood as she entered. "Thanks for coming." "No problem." That answer bothered him more than irritation would have. Because she wasn't nervous. People were supposed to be nervous in this room. She sat calmly, placing her notebook in front of her without opening it. Daniel Reeves studied her carefully over folded hands. Legal people had a particular stillness to them. Predatory patience, the kind that made every silence feel intentional. "Ms. Morales," he began, "we reviewed the Section 11 dependency assessment this morning." "I assumed you would." The COO shifted slightly. Ethan leaned forward. "Why exactly was this document created?" Lena met his eyes. "Because governance requested operational continuity mapping after the merger." "Yes, but—" "You signed the initiative approval." She said it gently. That made it worse. Daniel slowly opened a binder. Colored tabs. Notes. Highlighted sections. "According to these records," he said, "multiple critical functions rely on informal labor outside your contractual scope." "Correct." The HR director jumped in too quickly. "We encourage cross-functional collaboration here." Lena nodded once. "Collaboration is temporary support. Structural dependency is different." Silence. Daniel turned another page. "Did management explicitly instruct you to absorb these responsibilities?" "No." "Then why did you?" Now the room finally reached the real question. Not legal. Psychological. Why do high performers volunteer to become load-bearing walls? Lena looked toward the rain beyond the glass windows. Chicago looked blurred today. Gray towers dissolving into low clouds. "When the merger happened," she said quietly, "everything started breaking at once. Payroll escalations, vendor failures, compliance gaps. Nobody had full process visibility." Ethan rubbed his temple. "So you stepped in?" "Yes." "And nobody asked you to?" "No." The HR director exhaled sharply, relieved. But Daniel wasn't relieved. Not even close. Because he understood the actual danger. "You documented the dependency," he said carefully, "and continued operating under it for over a year." "Yes." "And yesterday you stopped." "Yesterday," Lena corrected softly, "I began following my contract." The sentence landed with almost physical force. The external counsel finally spoke. Cold voice, New York accent. "How many operational functions are currently unsupported without your discretionary involvement?" Lena answered immediately. "Depends how you define unsupported." "Define it." She opened her notebook for the first time. Not emotional notes, process maps, timelines, escalation chains. 23 recurring functions experienced disruption within 48 hours. The COO sat straighter. Disruption meaning what exactly? Delayed approvals, missed sequencing windows, regulatory lag, reporting failures, executive bottlenecks. Daniel looked up sharply. Executive bottlenecks? "You'd be surprised," Lena said calmly, "how many executives rely on undocumented labor." Nobody spoke. Somewhere outside the conference room, a phone rang twice before stopping abruptly. Tiny sounds suddenly felt louder in tension like this. Ethan folded his arms. "If this is retaliation, it isn't." Her answer came instantly. "In fact," she continued, "I specifically avoided any non-compliant action." Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly. Because that mattered. A lot. Everything she had done was procedurally clean, no sabotage, no policy violations, no misconduct. She had simply stopped donating invisible labor, and legally that distinction was enormous. The external counsel leaned back slowly. "How long?" she asked. "Would you estimate before operational degradation becomes externally visible?" Lena took a sip of now lukewarm coffee. "Some already is." The COO's face changed. "What?" "Zurich compliance sequencing missed this morning's transfer window." Ethan turned sharply. "What?" "Procurement didn't submit vendor reconciliation on time." "Why wasn't it escalated?" Lena looked at him quietly. "Because escalation management isn't in my scope." Silence again. Heavy now, dense, like storm pressure before lightning. Daniel closed the binder carefully, and that was when Lena realized something important. Legal wasn't angry at her. Legal was angry at leadership, because executives had accidentally created a single point of operational failure without governance protection. A nightmare scenario, especially if documented, especially if tied to promotion denials, especially if tied to compensation disparity. The HR director tried again. "Lena, surely you understand this creates instability." "No," Lena replied softly. "The instability already existed. I just stopped hiding it." That one sentence cut through the room like glass. Ethan stood and walked toward the windows. For the first time since she'd known him, he looked older than polished. Not weak, just suddenly aware of consequences. Rain streaked behind him in silver lines. "You could have handled this differently." There it was. Not, "You're wrong," but "You exposed it." Lena almost smiled. "I asked for support repeatedly." Daniel looked toward HR immediately. The HR director froze. Bad sign. Very bad sign. Because now legal had a timeline to investigate, and timelines create liability. Ethan turned back slowly. "What do you want?" Simple question, dangerous question. The room became perfectly still. Lena could hear the faint hum of recessed ceiling lights. She thought about the late nights, the airport calls, the migraines, the forgotten weekends, the way executives praised her reliability while quietly building systems around her unpaid exhaustion. Then she answered, "I want the company to function without exploiting people who care too much." Nobody expected that answer, especially not Ethan, because it wasn't ambitious enough. No salary demand, no threat, no dramatic ultimatum, which somehow made it infinitely harder to negotiate against. Daniel tapped a pen lightly against the table. "You saved the email." Not a question. Lena looked at him. "Yes." "And other documentation?" "Yes." The COO visibly paled. Tiny reaction. Easy to miss. Impossible once noticed. The external counsel finally closed her notebook. "I recommend immediate operational audit and dependency redistribution." Translation: this situation is dangerous. Ethan understood it too. You could see the calculation happening behind his eyes now. Not moral calculation. Corporate survival calculation. How expensive would this become? How visible? How traceable? And perhaps most unsettling of all, who else in the company was silently overperforming without recognition? Because once one person stopped, others might notice they could too. That was the real contagion. Not rebellion. Boundaries. An assistant suddenly entered the room without knocking. Everyone turned. She looked terrified. "Sorry, Zurich is escalating directly to executive channels." Nobody answered immediately. The assistant swallowed. They're asking why operations stopped responding. Slowly, very slowly, all eyes turned toward Lena, and for the first time, she saw it clearly in their expressions. They still thought she would save them, instinctively, automatically, like always. But Lana simply folded her hands, calm, professional, untouchably calm. Operations, she said politely, is responding within contractual obligations. The room went dead silent, because now they finally understood. She wasn't threatening the system. She was letting it reveal itself. And systems built on invisible sacrifice rarely survive exposure. At 10:11 a.m., Senior Counsel requested a full executive dependency review. At 10:14, HR canceled 3 promotion committee meetings. At 10:19, Ethan received a board inquiry asking why critical workflows lacked documented ownership. And at 10:32, for the first time in 4 years, Lena took her full lunch break away from her desk. The office watched her leave like passengers watching someone calmly walk away from a car seconds before it explodes. By afternoon, whispers had already started spreading between departments. She stopped covering for them. Legal got involved. They're auditing executive workflows. They denied her promotion. No way. Oh, they did. And somewhere deep inside the building's polished machinery, fear began moving faster than email. Because employees were opening contracts, managers were rereading role descriptions, and executives were suddenly discovering how fragile power becomes when the people holding everything together finally decide to stop bleeding quietly. The first domino had already fallen. Nobody yet understood how many were connected behind it. If they had, they would have panicked much sooner. If this story hit a little too close to reality, that's probably because every office has a Lena, someone carrying entire systems on invisible overtime, someone called valuable right up until they ask for recognition, someone, one ignored email away from changing the balance of power. And the frightening part, most companies don't realize who's truly holding everything together until that person quietly steps back. Subscribe for the next chapter. Because after the audit begins, executives start discovering what Lena documented and who else may have been taking credit for her work. By Wednesday morning, the office no longer sounded the same. Corporate buildings have rhythms. Normally, this one moved with artificial confidence. Badge scanners chirping, hurried footsteps, espresso grinders roaring like tiny engines of ambition. Conversations layered over keyboard clicks in a familiar ecosystem of deadlines and polite exhaustion. Now, everything felt half a second delayed, like a song slipping out of sync. People lowered voices when Lena walked past, not because they blamed her, because they were recalculating reality around her. The dangerous thing about invisible labor is that once someone points at it, you start seeing it everywhere. A senior analyst covering for incompetent management, an assistant secretly coordinating 3 executives' calendars because none of them could organize themselves, a developer fixing temporary system errors every weekend for 2 years. The illusion cracks all at once, and suddenly entire companies start looking haunted. Lana noticed the change immediately when she entered operations at exactly 9 a.m., not 8:15, not 7:40, 9, according to contract. Heads lifted subtly above monitors. Someone from procurement gave her a tiny nod of respect. Another employee quickly minimized a spreadsheet labeled Role alignment review. Interesting. Very interesting. Noah rolled his chair toward her before she even sat down. You started a civil war. Lena opened her laptop calmly. I updated process boundaries. That's corporate language for setting the building on fire. One corner of her mouth moved faintly. Has legal contacted finance? 3 times. He rubbed his face dramatically. They requested undocumented workflow dependencies, off-cycle approvals, discretionary labor records. He leaned closer. They specifically asked who handles executive reconciliation during reporting gaps. And? Noah stared at her. I told them the truth. That sentence hung between them quietly, because honesty becomes radioactive inside systems built on informal exploitation. A Slack notification appeared on Lena's screen. Mandatory executive audit interview, 11:30 a.m. Another one. Fast, too fast. That meant counsel had already found something worse than expected. She closed the notification without reacting. But inside, a small, cold instinct sharpened. Executives panic in predictable stages. First denial, then containment, then documentation review. And documentation review was where careers quietly died. At 10:07 a.m., Ethan Vale lost patience for the first time. The board call was supposed to be routine: damage assessment, containment strategy, minimal exposure. Instead, one director asked a simple question that detonated the room. Why was a mid-level operations manager performing executive continuity functions without formal authority? Silence. Ethan gave the polished version first. Cross-functional initiative drift after the merger. Another board member spoke immediately. That's not drift. That's governance failure. There it was. The phrase nobody wanted written anywhere. Governance failure. Legal terminology with teeth. The external counsel on the call adjusted her glasses. We're also evaluating compensation disparity relative to functional responsibility. Translation: if this escalates externally, it becomes discoverable. Ethan muted himself briefly, but not before everyone heard him exhale. Hard. Back in operations, Lena was reviewing vendor escalation queues when Priya from compliance appeared beside her desk. You have a minute? Sure. Priya sat carefully, like someone approaching unexploded ordnance. I need to ask you something unofficially. Okay. Did you know Zurich escalated directly to the board liaison? Lena looked up slowly. No. That's bad. It's accurate. Priya lowered her voice further. Leadership thought this would stabilize in a day or two. Lena almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because it revealed how deeply executives misunderstood their own company. You cannot abruptly remove years of invisible infrastructure and expect stability, especially when nobody documented where the infrastructure even existed. They built systems around undocumented labor, Lena said quietly. Systems like that collapse slowly at first. Priya studied her. You really planned this? No. Lena leaned back. I planned to survive it. That answer stayed with Priya long after she walked away, because there was no revenge in Lena's voice, only exhaustion. And exhaustion is much harder to morally dismiss. At 11:30 sharp, Lena entered conference room C, smaller than the executive boardroom. No windows. Intentional. Rooms without windows make people feel trapped faster. Daniel Reeves was already there, so was external counsel. But this time another person sat beside them. Internal audit. Now things were accelerating. Very quickly. Daniel gestured toward the chair. Thank you for coming again. Lena sat. The auditor opened a folder thick enough to concern anyone with survival instincts. We reviewed your escalation history. Okay. There are inconsistencies. That word again. Corporate vocabulary loved euphemisms. Inconsistencies meant someone lied, or worse, someone took credit. The auditor slid several printed emails across the table. Lena recognized them immediately. Executive summaries, crisis mitigation proposals, vendor recovery sequencing, her work, signed by someone else. Interesting. Very interesting. The auditor watched her carefully. Did you prepare these documents? Yes. But they were submitted under executive authorship. Yes. Why? Lena answered without hesitation. Because leadership requested consolidated communication channels during the merger. The external counsel leaned forward slightly. Did leadership instruct you to omit attribution? Careful question. Legal grade, careful. Yes. Silence. Pens stopped moving. Daniel looked up slowly. Who specifically? There it was. The real threshold. Names. Companies can survive inefficiency. They can survive burnout. What they fear is traceable accountability attached to identifiable individuals. Lena folded her hands together calmly. I'd prefer written inquiry procedures. The auditor blinked. Even Daniel looked mildly impressed. That answer changed everything, because it confirmed two things simultaneously. 1, she understood legal exposure. 2, she had documentation ready. Outside the room, thunder rolled faintly over the city. The building lights flickered once. Nobody moved. The external counsel closed one folder and opened another. This review may expand significantly. I assumed it would. Daniel watched her for a long moment, then finally asked the question that had probably been bothering him since Tuesday morning. Why save the email? Lena looked at him quietly. Because people rewrite history when pressure starts. Nobody spoke after that, because everyone in the room knew she was right, especially legal. Legal exists because memory becomes extremely flexible near liability. At 1:08 p.m., the rumor exploded across the company. Not officially. Officially, nothing was happening. But corporate ecosystems spread panic, like nervous systems spread pain. A director canceled vacation unexpectedly. HR leadership locked calendar visibility. 2 executives suddenly updated LinkedIn profiles during work hours. And somewhere on the 16th floor, someone whispered, "They're auditing authorship on merger recovery reports." That was the moment fear became personal. Not operational, personal. Because if Lena's documentation proved executives had redistributed her labor upward while denying advancement, the story changed entirely. Then it wasn't merely exploitation, it was appropriation. And appropriation leaves fingerprints. Noah appeared at her desk again around 3. You need to see this. He placed a printed org chart beside her keyboard. Someone had highlighted 14 workflow chains in red, all converging on her role like veins returning to a heart. Lena stared at it silently. Noah lowered his voice. I don't think they realized how bad it was. No, she said softly. They realized. That distinction mattered. A lot. Ignoring a problem accidentally is negligence. Ignoring it deliberately is strategy. Across the room, a manager suddenly snapped at an employee over a delayed approval queue. Stress was leaking now. Visible, sharp-edged. And when stress leaks downward in corporations, truth usually follows behind it. A notification appeared on Lena's monitor. Meeting request. Ethan Vale. Private, 5 p.m. No HR, no legal, no counsel, just him. Interesting. Very interesting. At 4:52 p.m., rain hammered the windows hard enough to blur the skyline completely. The executive office looked different without sunlight. Colder. More honest, somehow. Ethan stood near the glass when Lena entered. No assistant, no performance smile, just a tired man in an expensive suit staring at a city disappearing into storm clouds. "Sit down." She did. For several seconds, neither spoke. Then Ethan finally turned. "I underestimated this." Yes. No hostility, no triumph. Just fact. That unsettled him more than anger ever could. He sat across from her slowly. Legal thinks this could become systemic exposure. They're probably right. A humorless laugh escaped him. "You know what the board asked me today?" Lena waited. They asked whether our operational resilience depended on undocumented emotional loyalty. Silence. Then Ethan rubbed both hands over his face. "Do you know how insane that sounds?" Lena looked at the storm outside. "No." Her voice stayed quiet. "It sounds expensive." For the first time in days, Ethan almost smiled. Almost. Then his expression darkened again. "They're reviewing executive attribution records. There's usually a reason legal escalates authorship audits." His jaw tightened slightly. There, a reaction. Small but real. And suddenly Lena understood something important. He knew exactly what they were going to find. The storm outside deepened. Water streaked across the glass in silver rivers. Inside the office, the silence stretched long enough to become dangerous. Finally, Ethan asked, "What happens if other employees start doing what you did?" Lena answered immediately. "They already are." The color drained from his face almost invisibly. Tiny shift. Massive implication. Because once one person establishes boundaries successfully, others begin testing whether survival is possible outside exploitation. And organizations built on overextension hate that idea more than almost anything. Ethan stared out at the rain again. The city below looked fractured by water and headlights. For the first time in years, he seemed less like a CEO and more like a man realizing he no longer fully understood the machine beneath him. Then quietly, without looking at her, he asked, "How many people are holding this company together without us noticing?" Lena stood, picked up her notebook, and gave him the most frightening answer he'd heard all week. "You probably don't want the real number." Then she walked out, leaving the office silent, except for rain and the faint hum of a building beginning to understand its own structural cracks. Behind her, Ethan remained motionless for a very long time. Because somewhere deep down, he already knew the worst part. If Lena had documented everything, she was never the only one. And once employees realize invisible labor can become visible, entire empires start trembling. Thursday arrived with sunlight so sharp it made the glass towers look brittle. After 3 days of rain, the city had emerged, polished and dangerous. Sidewalks shining, traffic lights reflected in puddles like broken neon. From the 23rd floor, downtown Chicago looked deceptively clean. Inside the company, nothing was clean anymore. At 8:41 a.m., before Lena even reached her desk, she noticed something strange. People had stopped pretending. That was new. For years, corporate tension had lived beneath layers of smiles and quick syncs and strategically cheerful Slack emojis. But now exhaustion and suspicion floated openly through the halls like smoke after an electrical fire. An HR manager argued quietly near the elevators. Two directors exited a conference room mid-conversation the second they noticed legal approaching. Someone from strategy carried 3 archive boxes labeled Merger Documentation Review. Noah spotted Lena immediately. "Oh, good," he muttered dramatically. "The main character is here. You look tired. I slept 3 hours because audit requested timestamp verification on 18 months of reporting workflows. That sounds unpleasant. That sounds criminal adjacent." Lena almost smiled as she logged in. Her inbox loaded slowly, then kept loading, then kept loading. 73 unread emails, 31 marked urgent, 7 labeled confidential. Interesting, very interesting. She opened the first message. Subject, clarification request. Executive workflow attribution, the second. Subject, historical escalation, ownership confirmation. The third, subject, preservation, notice. That one made her pause. Preservation, notice, legal language, heavy language. The kind companies use when they become afraid documents may matter later. Noah watched her expression carefully. "What?" Counsel issued preservation instructions. His face lost color instantly. "Oh, yes." Because now this wasn't merely operational, it was defensive. Companies only start preserving records when they begin calculating future exposure. And future exposure meant someone, somewhere, believed this situation could become public. At 9:12 a.m., HR sent a company-wide email about process realignment initiatives. Employees reacted exactly the way people always react to corporate euphemisms. They panicked harder. Slack channels exploded quietly. Not public channels, private ones. The real nervous system of every organization. Lena saw messages arriving faster than she could read them. "Did you hear audit interviewed procurement yesterday? Apparently, legal requested deleted workflow records. Someone said executive assistants are being questioned too. Wait, is this about Lena? No way this is just about one person anymore." That last message mattered, because it was true. This had stopped being about Lena the moment people recognized themselves inside the pattern. One employee, sacrificing weekends. Another absorbing missing headcount responsibilities. Another unofficially managing entire systems without title adjustments. Once employees start comparing hidden labor, corporate mythology collapses frighteningly fast. At 10:03 a.m., Priya from compliance appeared beside Lena's desk again. This time, she looked genuinely rattled. "They're reviewing promotion denials." Lena looked up slowly. "All of them?" 3 years. Interesting. That was escalation, real escalation. Because now legal wasn't examining only workflow dependency. They were investigating organizational behavior patterns, which meant someone at the top had become nervous enough to widen scope. "Do you know what triggered it?" Lena asked. Priya hesitated, then lowered her voice. Someone in audit cross-referenced denied promotions against undocumented workload expansion. For the first time all week, Lena leaned back silently. Not shocked, but thoughtful. Because that meant someone extremely competent had entered the investigation. Someone who understood systems. And systems leave patterns. The office printer nearby jammed loudly. Nobody moved to fix it. Tiny thing. But Lena noticed. People were distracted now. Unfocused. Corporate fear destroys efficiency long before it destroys structure. At 11:47 a.m., the first executive resignation rumor appeared. Unofficial, unverified, wildly specific, exactly the kind most likely to be true. By lunch, half the company believed the COO was preparing an exit strategy. By 1 p.m., assistants were quietly downloading old meeting records. By 1:40, someone in finance accidentally forwarded an internal risk memo to the wrong distribution list. Noah read it twice, then walked directly to Lena. "You need to see this." He placed his laptop beside her keyboard. One paragraph was highlighted yellow. Operational continuity relied disproportionately on discretionary labor performed outside formally compensated role boundaries. Below that, potential attribution inconsistencies under review. There it was again. Attribution. Such a polite word for theft. Lena stared at the screen quietly. Noah lowered his voice. "They're terrified." "Yes." "You seem very calm about that." Lena closed the laptop gently. "Because panic doesn't change documentation." That sentence spread through operations before the afternoon ended. Nobody admitted repeating it, but they did. Because offices function like ecosystems, fear travels fast, but certainty travels faster. And Lena sounded certain. At 2:16 p.m., council requested another private meeting. This time the invitation included external audit liaison present. That changed the atmosphere instantly. Internal investigations can be controlled. External reviews cannot. Conference room E was colder than the others, aggressively air-conditioned, aggressively bright. The external auditor introduced herself as Marianne Holt, former federal compliance investigator. Even her handshake felt procedural. She opened immediately. "We're trying to understand whether operational dependency correlated with advancement suppression." Direct. No corporate anesthesia. Lena respected that. Marianne slid several documents across the table. Promotion evaluations, performance reviews, compensation comparisons. Lena recognized phrases instantly. Excellent under pressure, reliable beyond scope, critical support resource, and beneath all of them, no promotion, no title expansion, no compensation alignment. Marianne watched her carefully. "Did anyone ever explain the discrepancy?" "No." "Did you ask?" "Yes." "What response did you receive?" Lena met her eyes. "Usually some variation of timing." Marianne nodded slowly, like someone confirming an equation. Daniel Reeves sat quietly beside her, observing everything. He barely spoke now, which meant legal was no longer leading. They were documenting. Huge difference. Marianne flipped another page. "Did executives rely on your reluctance to let systems fail?" Silence. Not because Lena didn't understand, because the question was brutally accurate. Finally, she answered. "Yes." Daniel's pen stopped moving. Marianne leaned back. "And when did you realize that?" Lena looked toward the reflection in the glass wall. Not herself. The room behind her, people, folders, records, consequences. "The day they told me I still wasn't ready." The sentence stayed in the air quietly. No drama, no tears, just devastating clarity. Because suddenly the entire psychological structure became visible. The company had benefited from her competence, while preserving the fiction that she hadn't earned advancement yet. Not despite her overperformance, because of it. Promoting her would have forced them to replace the invisible labor she provided cheaply. And replacing invisible labor is expensive, very expensive. Marianne closed the folder softly. "I think," she said carefully, "your organization confused endurance with availability." Even Daniel looked affected by that one, because it was bigger than policy failure now. It was cultural. the most dangerous kind of failure. At 4:08 p.m., the explosion finally happened. Not literal, corporate, which is often worse. An internal attribution review uncovered that multiple merger recovery presentations credited executive leadership for operational strategies Lena had authored entirely. Time-stamped drafts proved it, metadata proved it, archived revisions proved it. And worst of all, the documentation trail showed executives discussing her lack of leadership readiness while simultaneously using her work to stabilize board confidence. By 4:30, entire floors felt electrically unstable. Assistants stopped gossiping and started whispering. Directors closed office doors. Someone cried in a stairwell. Noah appeared again, looking almost impressed now. "You know what this reminds me of?" "What?" "Watching engineers realize the bridge has been held together with duct tape for years." Lena gathered her things calmly. "Most systems fail gradually first." "No," Noah said quietly. "This one failed the second you stopped pretending." That landed harder than he intended, because it was true. The collapse had not started when Lena established boundaries. The collapse started years earlier, when leadership built critical infrastructure around someone they never intended to properly acknowledge. Thursday evening, sunlight stretched gold across the office windows as employees quietly packed bags and carried tension home with them. But almost nobody truly disconnected. Phones kept buzzing. Emails kept arriving. Rumors multiplied faster than facts. And somewhere high above the city, inside a boardroom glowing against the darkening skyline, executives were learning a lesson corporations relearn every generation. People will tolerate exhaustion for a surprisingly long time. They will tolerate disrespect longer than they should. They will even tolerate being overlooked. But the moment someone calmly documents the imbalance, the entire machine becomes vulnerable to truth. At 6:22 p.m., Lena finally shut down her computer. Exactly on time. No extra hour, no quick fix, no invisible rescue mission. As she stood to leave, her monitor reflected briefly in the darkened office glass. For the first time in years, she didn't look tired. Behind her, operations buzzed with quiet panic. Ahead of her, the elevator doors opened with a soft, metallic sigh. And somewhere deep inside executive leadership, people were beginning to understand the terrifying difference between an employee who can quit and one who can prove exactly how much damage their silence was hiding. The board meeting scheduled for Friday morning had just been upgraded to emergency status, and nobody slept well after that notification arrived. Friday began before sunrise for the executive floor. By 5:12 a.m., lights were already glowing behind frosted glass walls, 23 stories above the river. Assistants carried coffee trays, with the careful silence of hospital staff outside operating rooms. Legal arrived with rolling cases full of binders. Audit arrived with laptops and expressions carved from stone. Nobody joked. Nobody lingered. The building itself felt tense, as if steel beams could sense liability. Outside, dawn slowly dragged pale silver across Chicago's skyline. The river looked black from above, slicing through the city like a crack in dark glass. Inside Boardroom A, executives prepared for impact. Because by now everyone understood the same terrifying thing. This was no longer about one denied promotion. It was about systemic dependency, misrepresented operational ownership, and documented executive awareness. In other words, the kind of phrases that survive in lawsuits forever. Lana arrived at exactly 8:58 a.m. Same black coat, same calm expression, same measured pace. That unnerved people more every day. A woman from HR watched her cross the lobby with the expression of someone observing a controlled fire approach a gas line. Noah met her near the elevators. "You ready?" "No." He blinked. "That's the first honest, terrifying thing you've said all week." The elevator climbed silently. Noah glanced sideways. "You know they pulled 6 years of executive communications?" Lena's eyes shifted slightly. "That's aggressive. That's panic." The doors opened. The executive floor looked transformed overnight. Boxes, documents, 2 external consultants, a forensic IT specialist. Interesting. Very interesting. Someone had escalated beyond containment. Now they were preparing for survivability. At 9:07 a.m., the emergency board session began. This time, Lena wasn't seated near the middle of the table. A deliberate change. Counsel placed her beside Audit. Symbolism matters in rooms like this. Ethan Vale looked exhausted. Not physically, structurally. Like someone carrying a building that had started cracking beneath him. The board chair opened immediately. "We need clarity on operational dependency exposure. No introductions, no performance civility, straight to damage." Marianne Holt activated the first screen. A workflow map appeared across the wall display. Lines, departments, approval chains, and at the center of almost everything, Lena. Not officially, operationally. The visual hit the room harder than documents ever could, because people ignore text, they fear patterns. One board member leaned forward slowly. "How was this allowed to happen?" Nobody answered immediately. Then the COO tried. "The merger created temporary strain," Marianne interrupted. "Temporary systems do not generate 4 years of dependency history." Silence. Absolute silence. Another screen appeared. Promotion denial timelines, cross-referenced against workload expansion. More responsibility. More executive reliance. More after-hours intervention. No advancement. The board chair removed his glasses slowly. When exactly was leadership planning to correct this? Nobody answered. Because there was no answer that didn't sound catastrophic. Ethan finally spoke. "We believed she was developing toward executive readiness." Lena looked at him quietly. Marianne did not. She was already performing executive continuity functions. The room chilled another few degrees, because everyone understood the implication. They hadn't been evaluating readiness. They had been delaying cost. A board member from the far end finally spoke for the first time. "Did anyone calculate replacement exposure?" The CFO answered weakly. "Not formally." Marianne clicked another slide. Actually, someone had. A risk estimate appeared on screen. Projected disruption cost, $48 million. The room stopped breathing. Noah, seated near finance observers, stared openly. Someone whispered, "Jesus Christ." But the number wasn't the worst part. The worst part came underneath. Primary risk driver. Undocumented operational knowledge concentration. In simpler language, the company had built critical infrastructure around one exhausted employee and called it efficiency. At 10:16 a.m., things became personal. Forensic review uncovered internal executive messages. Not illegal, worse, dismissive. One message from 18 months earlier appeared on screen. "Lena will handle it. She always does." Another, no need to expand headcount while she's absorbing overflow. Another, promotion might reduce flexibility. Nobody moved, not even slightly, because now the room had crossed the invisible border between negligence and awareness. Ethan's face hardened. The COO looked physically ill. And somewhere near the far end of the table, a board member quietly closed a notebook, as if suddenly understanding the scale of what they were sitting inside. Lena remained completely still. That frightened them too, because she wasn't surprised, meaning she had probably known for longer than anyone imagined. Marianne turned toward the board. This organization normalized discretionary overperformance to the point of structural dependency. The board chair spoke carefully. Can that dependency be repaired? Long pause. Then, finally, Lena answered. Yes. Every head turned toward her. Even now, after everything, the room instinctively waited for her solution. That was the most revealing part. She noticed it too. You document ownership correctly, she said calmly. You redistribute responsibility. You hire enough people. You stop rewarding silent self-destruction as professionalism. Nobody interrupted, because suddenly the language in the room sounded less corporate and more human, which made it far more uncomfortable. At 11:02 a.m., the board requested private executive recess. Translation: someone was about to become expendable. Lena stepped into the corridor outside boardroom A. Sunlight flooded the hallway now, sharp and white across polished floors. For the first time all week, she felt tired. Not vindicated, not triumphant, just deeply, profoundly tired. Noah joined her carrying 2 coffees. He handed her one silently. You okay? Honestly? Yeah. I think I forgot what normal boundaries feel like. That hit him harder than any boardroom revelation, because it sounded so simple and so devastating. Employees shouldn't need organizational collapse to rediscover basic limits. Down the corridor, voices rose sharply behind closed doors. Not shouting. Board-level anger is quieter than that. Sharper, like knives wrapped in velvet. Noah leaned against the wall. You know what's insane? What? Half the company thinks you orchestrated some genius revenge strategy. Lena stared into her coffee. I was just tired of pretending the workload was reasonable. He laughed once under his breath. That somehow makes this scarier. At 12:24 p.m., the board reconvened. The atmosphere had changed again. Decisions had been made. You could always tell. Executives sat differently after survival calculations. The board chair folded his hands. Effective immediately, we are initiating full operational restructuring and independent governance oversight. Corporate language. But underneath it, people were losing power. Possibly positions, possibly careers. The chair continued. Promotion review procedures will also undergo external audit. The HR director looked like she hadn't slept in years. Then came the final surprise. Ms. Morales, the chair said carefully, the board would like to discuss a newly created leadership role. There it was, the moment everyone expected. The cinematic correction, the reward, the redemption arc. Around the table, people waited. Even Ethan watched her carefully now. But Lena surprised all of them. No. The silence afterward felt enormous. The board chair blinked. I'm sorry. I'm declining. Nobody moved. Noah nearly dropped his coffee. Ethan stared at her openly now. Why? Lena looked around the room slowly. at legal, at audit, at leadership, at the polished machinery finally admitting what it had become. Then she answered softly, "Because I don't want a promotion built from a crisis you ignored until it became expensive." Nobody spoke. The sunlight across the table seemed almost too bright suddenly. Lena stood calmly. "For years," she continued, "everyone here called the system successful because one person kept sacrificing enough to hide the damage." Her gaze moved briefly toward Ethan. "That's not leadership, that's dependency with better branding." Somewhere near the back of the room, someone stopped typing. Completely. "You asked whether the company can recover," she said. "It can." Then a small pause. "But only if you stop confusing loyalty with free labor." No dramatic music, no shouting. Just truth landing heavily inside a room, finally unable to outrank it. Lena picked up her notebook. And for the first time all week, nobody tried to stop her from leaving. Because they understood something now. She had already done the hardest thing possible. She had made the invisible visible. And once that happens, systems either change or collapse under the weight of what they were hiding all along. As the elevator doors closed behind her, the executive floor remained silent. Not peaceful silence. The other kind. The kind that comes after impact. The kind where everyone quietly realizes the crisis was never the woman who established boundaries. The crisis was the culture that treated boundaries like betrayal in the first place. And somewhere deep inside the company's endless maze of glass offices and glowing screens, employees were opening old contracts, checking role descriptions, and asking themselves a question leadership should have feared years ago. What exactly am I being paid to carry?